So first of all, thank you for joining tonight. I'd like to introduce our guest speaker tonight, Dr. Maeve McLoughlin, Princ Principal Scientist of RPS Consultants, with over 20 years experience in advising clients on interpreting environmental policy, managing environmental risk, developing and implementing environmental and broader sustainability strategies, and managing voluntary and mandatory reporting requirements. Maeve's in-house and consultancy experience spans a wide range of industries, which she'll touch on later during the presentation, and includes financial services, media, and built infrastructure. Thank you, Maeve, for taking the time to present on this extremely interesting and exciting topic, which is a hot topic for everybody in our industry at the moment.
Thanks, Denise. Hi, everyone. So as Denise said, I work in RPS, work in their sustainability team. Talking to Jim Leahy when he mentioned this lecture and this series of lectures, and I was thinking about what would be a useful kind of subjects to talk on. And I'm just mindful of the wave of directives, regulations, sectoral policy, sectoral targets that are coming down the line or are already in place. And I thought it might be useful to deliver a talk on how I have delivered sustainability strategies in practice. And so I'm just going to go through this and deliver a talk on my insights, and hopefully they'll be of some use. So before I start, I just wanted to go through my career journey to date. So I have a background in environmental science. Have an undergraduate in environmental science and a master's in environmental monitoring, computer modeling and management. And then in 2004, I kickstarted my career with RPS in London, actually, working in their due diligence property transaction team. I first of all worked in contaminated land, and then I moved into ecology, flood risk, and then environmental impact assessments. And in terms of the kind of main insights from that period of my life, it would be really the understanding of a risk-based approach to managing environmental risks, which is something that I hadn't been taught in either of my degrees to that point. Kind of with my, idealistic, fresh out of my master's approach, I mentioned to my manager at the time, why aren't we getting, why aren't we looking to remediate this section of land that we were looking at to pristine environmental quality? And he said, well, who's going to pay for that? And I was like, well, the polluter pays. And he explained that the polluter is a Printworks that shut up shop in 1890, and the land now sits with the local authority. So ultimately, it's public expenditure. So I suppose it was my first time, and kind of, you gain that when you work in the real world of understanding the realities, the economic realities. After about 5 years at RPS, the projects I was working on at the time, we tended to kind of hand over the reports and the recommendations to clients, and we weren't there to work with them on implementation. So I wanted to get some experience on implementation, and so I started working in-house for a number of companies across the next 5 years. The first company I worked for was Accenture. So I was responsible for rolling out their environmental management system, their EMS, across the UK and Ireland, trying to get their accreditation up to ISO 14001. And the kind of main takeaway from that time was the importance of environmental management system, and it's a very good framework for managing environmental risks. From there, I took a role at Network Rail as their environment policy specialist, and my role was kind of varied. I was looking at how forthcoming European legislation would translate how it would impact the rail industry. I was also working on sustainable line side strategies, sustainable supply chain strategies, and waste management standards for the company. Again, the main takeaway from Network Rail, it's a public funded body, although it's privately owned, is that kind of the clashing of environmental quality with economic realities. I remember speaking to a line side manager, and they explained how putting newt fencing down, newt fencing, if you're not aware, is very tiny plastic fencing to stop the great crested newt from going from A to B. And it cost the project £50,000, which was in 2009 or so, 2010, which is an extortionate amount of money for just one line side project, which of course Network Rail did thousands of them every year. So again, it just kind of hit home to me the kind of the limitations of achieving, or the challenges of achieving environmental high quality and pristine quality with the constraints of kind of public expenditure caps. from Network Rail, I then went to work for Channel 4. I wanted to get experience on at the time, the corporate responsibility agenda was kind of kicking off. So I wanted to get experience working kind of in community investment, strategy, diversity and inclusion, and also experience with reporting on that. My time at Channel 4, it's not surprisingly, as a media organization, my main kind of insight was the importance of employee engagement and the kind of fun that you can have. You can roll out lots of fun campaigns. You can really engage people in what you're doing, and getting kind of support at a grassroots level can help you get support at a board level. So it was a fun time, and I learned how to kind of run events, and we did various fair trade Friday initiatives, kind of running environmental fairs, and so on and so forth. I then took up a role at RSA Insurance, and my role there was I was their group environment manager, but I was also managing their corporate responsibility obligations. So as a financial services company, they had various, so they had to report into, well, they chose to report into Dow Jones for Good Sustainability Index, and their corporate responsibility report, and also part of their annual report. And my main takeaway from that time, and if there's one thing that you take away from today, is the importance of data management. It's not maybe the most glamorous thing, but if you're bigger than an SME, you really do need to have some kind of strategy and process in place in order that you kind of capture data, that you're not spending so much time. You hear, LinkedIn and otherwise, and I certainly experienced it, that sustainability teams can absolutely get overwhelmed with the amount of data management. The fourth kind of corporate sustainability reporting directive requires third-party assurance. So you do need to have your data verifiable. You need to have your source data lined up, and I'll talk more to that later on. I then got to a point in my career where, I wanted to go back and wanted to do a PhD. I was very interested in environmental regulations and how those were developed. Kind of throughout my course, throughout the time I was working in-house, I came aware of how kind of fragile and vulnerable corporate responsibility was, because it wasn't mandatory, it wasn't statutory. So if there was a change of board, if there was a change of leadership, a strategy you could have been working on for a year or more, it could just be shelved overnight. Whereas if it's ditched into regulations, companies are required to adhere to that. So whilst the CSRD, Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, it does seem quite onerous, it is going to drive change, and it is going to help organizations commit and stay with sustainability commitments. So I did a PhD in environmental risk regulation. I looked at the US and Europe in terms of how they developed their environmental risk regulation, and I focused in on vehicle emissions regulations. And one of the kind of surprising takeaways that relates to this area is what the US EPA and even the European Environment Agency, they used cost-benefit analysis to communicate the benefits and risks of regulations to policymakers. And indeed, it's one of the big levers for the US EPA and policymakers at the time to kind of to commit to certain regulations. So I moved back to Ireland in 2022, and then I commenced work with RPS again in 2023. And I started, so I work on environmental policy. I also work on various kind of sustainability strategies, net zero strategies, and so on. And I suppose my kind of main takeaway to date is that, people in the company are certainly, and people in Ireland are very sophisticated in terms of their understanding now compared to just 10 years ago. People are kind of at ease with the word sustainability, sustainable development, climate action. But I'm still seeing that the same kind of challenges and obstacles are lying underneath: stakeholder engagement, data management, and so on. So that's the main kind of insights from my career to date. So when you're developing a sustainability strategy, the first step really is to understand and define sustainability for your organization or for your project. And there are various definitions of sustainability. There's the triple bottom line, there's donut economics, and so on. But one definition that has stood the test of time is the UN Brundtland Commission definition, which is meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And this definition is built on 3 pillars: environmental, social, and economic. And one thing I would just say at this is that sustainability is about trying to balance those three pillars, and it is in itself a wicked problem. And that definition, which I've only came upon a few years ago, is a complex social or cultural problem that is difficult to solve because of its incomplete, contradictory, and changing requirements and constraints. There are unknown number of solutions, and there are various risk and benefit trade-offs. So really, there will never be just one sustainability strategy and one for your organization or for your project. There will always be options, and there will always be risk and trade-offs. But you can identify the optimal one for your business or organization at the time. And what's key to developing the kind of optimum one is stakeholder consultation, and I'll touch on that later. So as I said, the UN Brundtland Commission definition is built upon three pillars, so environmental, social, and economic. And under those sit the UN Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, and those have evolved from the Millennium Development Goals, MDGs, which sadly weren't achieved, so evolved into these SDGs. There are 17 of them. And it's a very good framework when you are starting to look at sustainability strategy for your business or for your project. But I would also go back a step. And in my opinion, engineering in itself is a transition to sustainable development. I would consider that building schools and hospitals aligns with Sustainable Development Goal 3, good health and well-being, and 4, quality education. Building roads and rail align with sustainable SDG 4, which is quality education, SDG 10, which is reduced inequalities, SDG 11, sustainable cities and communities. Ensuring we have water and wastewater infrastructure aligns with SDG 3, which is good health and well-being again, 6, clean water and sanitation. Building renewable energy technology and making sure the grid is resilient and aligns with SDG 9, 11 and 13. So before you kind of go ahead with going, oh, what do we need to do to achieve a sustainability strategy, it's worth understanding the core of your business, particularly engineering, and understanding, in my opinion, that you already do align with many of these SDGs. So building on that, what the next step really is to understand what is material to your organization. And in true Blue Peter style, here's one I made earlier. This is a materiality matrix based on the Global Reporting Index, the GRI reporting framework. And the way this is one was done in 2012. So the way that we did that is we obtained we did a risk horizon scanning of kind of current emerging risks. We then did an extensive stakeholder consultation, and I'm talking about governmental bodies, clients, investors, employees, your supply chain, to understand in terms of what we did as an insurance company at the time, what was our ability to influence and what was their priority. So we mapped it in this materiality matrix, and just to say, top right is what we felt was a priority to our stakeholders, but what was the greatest of our ability to influence. So at the time, it was identified as social inclusion, flooding, climate, safety and disasters. Also importantly was transparency, customer service, employee well-being and employee training. Down here we felt we had a high ability to influence product innovation, supply chain, diversity, direct environmental impact, business ethics, but it was less important to our stakeholders. Over here, it was not important to our stakeholders, and we felt we didn't have much ability to influence obesity, water scarcity, urbanization, and this was at the time. Again, you may be aware that through the CSRD, there is a requirement for a double materiality assessment. So this is building on the GRI impact materiality, which should be considered inside out. And that is the direct and indirect impact on business impacts on people and the environment. But it's also looking at financial materiality, which is looking outside in. And those are risks, opportunities that can influence business cash flow and value. So in order to achieve and undertake that double materiality assessment process, you do need to undertake extensive stakeholder consultation. You really need to understand what's important to your stakeholders. And once you've done that, you then can start understanding what's the gap. So building on your materiality, you also should really undertake a benchmarking analysis. You should look at what is international, European, national best practice, broadly in terms of kind of green policies, but also what's, considered best practice in terms of your sector. I'd also line that up with what are your statutory reporting obligations. So whether it's coming down the line with CSRD, whether you're a commercial semi-state, in terms of the kind of obligations under SEAI, and you might have monitoring and reporting obligations and so on. It depends what you might have. I'd also look at your organization. So if you're a subsidiary of a company, you may want to look at what the parent company is doing. Even if they have no relation in terms of the activities, it's a good idea to start to line up with how they are articulating their sustainable priorities, and particularly how they're going about kind of managing the capture of that data. So as I say, once you've undertaken those kind of 3 steps, then you can understand what's the gap between what you have in place and where you need to go. Once you've done that, you should start developing your strategy and your goals and your ambitions. So I would recommend that you focus on a SMART, specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and timely objectives, and where possible, align it with corporate strategy. It does take a lot of time to do stakeholder consultation, and it does take a lot of time to try and integrate it into corporate strategy. But in my experience, if you don't do that, you end up with a thin strategy that can sit on the shelf or is very vulnerable to, as I mentioned, leadership change or changes in the board, or any kind of restructuring activity. If you've taken time to do extensive stakeholder consultation, you've almost stitched it into people's psyches, and you can build up a kind of a grassroots interest, and you can also start kind of almost building on people's passion to work in purpose-led businesses. So kind of going on from that point, it's important that you set governance in place. So the main kind of part of that would be to really get a sponsor at a board level. That can be 1 person, could be 2, but either way, get somebody at a board level that kind of knows what you're doing or knows what the aim of the sustainability strategy is, and then try and ensure that you have time on the agenda at a regular basis. And similarly, I'd recommend that you align with your systems. Now, as engineers and engineering consultancies, you often have a lot of systems, but, so whether it's part of your integrated management system or ISO 14001, any of your systems, try to line up with those. Again, it's all part of trying to stitch it into your corporate strategy rather than having a kind of a standalone strategy that can be a little bit at risk. Similarly, start communicating with your value chain, with your supply chain. There's a lot of guidance coming out now as part of the Green Public Procurement Strategy that was launched during the summer. There's a lot of information online from the EPA around kind of specifying kind of green standards in contracts and how you go about integrating those into ITTs and PQQs and so on. So really, once you have your strategy in place, once you have your goals in place, start kind of pushing that down the supply chain. I'm aware that as engineers, you are also required to achieve project level sustainability, or you may be interested in undertaking sustainability strategies at a project level. Now, some of you may be familiar with this modular approach to looking at projects, but it's taken from BSEN 17472, which just trips off the tongue. It's basically a life cycle approach to looking at civil engineering works, and you focus in at pre-construction product stage, construction process stage, use stage, end of life stage, and then underneath those categories are subcategories. Certainly, speaking from RPS's point of view as design engineers, perhaps historically we maybe have been used to kind of looking at product stage, what can we do in terms of our design, and perhaps not thinking that we have any influence or control over the construction process stage, use stage, or end of life stage. But the decisions that you make at product stage, you are setting in stone for 60, 120, whatever life cycle of the asset is. So if you can start thinking ahead in terms of construction, use, and end of life, and building those considerations in, the better. As kind of the challenge with doing that is that you would need to engage with perhaps more of the value chain than perhaps historically. So you might need to speak to the client, and what we found are kind of collaborative workshops are quite useful. So you'd speak to the client, just say, look, we've identified that this is the carbon baseline at construction use end of life stage. Here are some high level reduction initiatives. But ultimately, you are going to have to stitch those into the contracts. You are going to have to appoint maintenance contractors and end of life that will start to think of that. And I think everyone may have seen examples online where you've seen really well thought out biodiversity kind of planting schemes, but after very short couple of years, the trees are all dead, and it's literally because it's not been incorporated or thought out as part of the maintenance schedule. So it's really important to whatever is being designed in at this stage, whether it's a mitigation measure through the EIA process, whether it's an additional sustainability initiative, whatever, if you can start to engage your value chain. When I talk about value chain, this is who I'm really talking about. I'm talking about the society users and occupiers, down to government, local authorities, down to regulators, asset owners, and how they're kind of supported in terms of building those assets, whether sponsors, lenders, and also the insurance that's needed, designers, constructors, product material suppliers. So this is been taken from, we came across it kind of initially from PAS 2080-2023, which some of you may be familiar with. It's a specification for managing carbon in the built environment. And again, it focuses on, yes, as a designer, you may have influence on the kind of what product you're specifying as part of the design, but you're also in a certain kind of early stage of the project that you can, if you kind of have those communications with the asset owners, the constructors, and understand how society is going to actually use this asset, then you can kind of translate the sustainability considerations and embed it throughout the whole life cycle of the project. So I then kind of move to the need for monitoring and communicating progress. And if, like I said, if there's one thing that you could take away from today, is the need for data management. It is so time consuming. And like I say, if it can just occupy sustainability teams, or if there's a one person who's dealing with it, it can end up being their whole day job. If you're bigger than an SME, look at your data management system. You can use Excel, but make sure that it's kind of linked, that you're using all the tabs, that it's not different. If you have a situation where you're kind of one Excel spreadsheet and then somebody is translating that to another Excel sheet and then another, you are increasing the risk of human error, which, like I said, with CSRD, you are going to be third party assured. And so you want to try and kind of rule out the potential for human errors as much as possible. I've used different platforms and I would strongly recommend them. I know that OneClick have a carbon management platform. I think of Ecometrica. I mean, there's loads out there. Or you could develop your own specific one. There's software like Power BI that can be used, and we've certainly used that to develop that for our clients. So when you're communicating, it's, as well as kind of external stakeholders. So for example, this is Tetra Tech's 2023 sustainability report. As part of CSRD, you will be required to have a sustainability state within your annual report, but you could, and you may well want to think about having a standalone sustainability report so that you can kind of communicate your progress to external stakeholders. But alongside that, I would also recommend that you continue to bring your internal stakeholders on the journey with you. In RPS, we have a green committee. They have kind of regular campaigns to look at our plastic use, to kind of promote active travel and so on and so forth. And it is a really good opportunity to engage with our employees. It's a good opportunity to kind of incentivize people. And, if people aren't kind of actively thinking of it in their day-to-day, it's a good opportunity to kind of influence the culture and the value of your organization. So definitely communication is a big part of the story. So really, there are 7 key steps from my experience in implementing sustainability in practice. There is defining the sustainability for your business and project. I would touch on the UN SDGs. They're a very good framework. But then I would also be mindful that under CSRD, and sorry to use all these acronyms, you might also need to align with the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, which are ESRSs. So those are going to be coming out, and they're generic, or in time they might become sector specific. So you need to look at what sustainability means for your business or for your project. You then need to understand what's material to your business or your project. Even if you're not required to comply with CSRD, as best practice, I'd suggest that you do a double materiality assessment. The Global Reporting Index impact materiality has been in place for a long time, looking at the impacts from outside in. That financial materiality step is kind of taking it to the next level. The third step is to undertake a gap analysis. So again, understand where you are and where you need to go, and understand the sectoral, in doing so, undertake a benchmark, understand your kind of organizational and statutory reporting requirements, so that you can start setting timelines, and so you stitch in your SMART objectives there. And like I said, develop a strategy in line with a SMART approach. Make sure that the goals that you're working towards are specific, they are measurable, they are achievable, they are realistic, and they are timely. We're past the point now of organizations, setting out audacious goals and ambitions that they were never going to achieve. The focus now is about specifics. So companies are increasingly required to be very specific about how they're going to achieve and what they're going to achieve and the timelines. So use a SMART approach, which is something that's coming down the line with the public sector. The fifth step would be integrate as much as you can into the core business or the project strategy. So don't have it running as a separate strategy, a standalone one that could sit on a shelf. Integrate it into your core business. Incorporate it with, if you've got a risk management process, incorporate it into that. If you've got environmental management system and you've got your aspects and impacts framework, incorporate it into all of that. The sixth step, ensure governance is in place. And governance needs to be top down, really. And you do need to have a board level sponsor, ideally. And ideally, it should be someone that's perhaps not just in HR or corporate communications. It needs to be in the kind of engineering, the core activity of whichever business you're in. Alongside that, it's a similar kind of governance, is to have, and build on your grassroots interest and set up kind of green champions teams, whether it's green committees or green teams or whatever you want to call it. But that kind of ensures that accountability at kind of grassroots level and lined up with board level. And then the seventh step is to monitor and communicate your progress all the way along. I would, along a lot of these kind of CSRD or SEAI requirements, it's all annual progress, but I would strongly recommend, certainly internally, that you communicate a lot more regularly, perhaps quarterly. And that, again, like I say, ensures that people are kind of engaged, they're aware, it starts to integrate into your culture, it starts to affect your values. But alongside all of these things, I'd remember to have fun with this. And one thing I think the big kind of lesson I took from Channel 4 is that you can achieve so much with, the lone polar bear sitting on an iceberg, but a lot of people are turned off by that, and they find it very kind of doom mongering. So if you can kind of focus on a more solution orientated positive approach, and your engineers, you're all about solutions. So I think if you can bring people on, and if you can develop these positive solutions, understanding that you are absolutely key to the sustainable transition, I think it will set your strategy up for success. So I've fairly rattled through that, but thanks everybody for your time today, and if you have any questions, I'm here to answer them. Thanks, Maren. Thanks, Denise.